Since the Cold War, America has thought itself invincible. But it could not stop Iran from seizing an oil tanker in recent days. Whether it couldn't or didn't depends on who you're hearing it from, as well as both sides' capabilities and policy. But hard facts also speak for themselves and appear to have surfaced quite late in Western media. So Iranian forces seized an oil tanker. Can sound hostile, but Iran says all it was doing was taking back what was its own property to begin with. Its action also served as a statement of sovereignty in our strategic southern waters of the Oman Sea. To hear what actually happened, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. Looking at the incident in light of rumors, it may sound confusing. A Vietnamese-flagged ship captured by Iran with America showing concern. What reads with what? Well, there's plenty of footage speaking for itself if only folks would have asked. Here's what happened. American forces confiscated a tanker that was carrying a cargo of Iranian oil in the Sea of Oman, and they transferred its consignment of crude oil to another vessel, which they started guiding to an unknown location. Well, the US has sanctioned Iran's oil and economy in general, but the sanctions are illegal by a couple of interpretations of international law, and to Iran, America's act was no more than an act of piracy. Naturally, Iranian forces wasted no time in recovering the oil. Mr. Ghaffari is editor-in-chief at a well-known daily. We visited to hear his well-studied media man's view of what America's timing and relaying of the incident meant.
نکته مهم این هستش که بعضاً ابهامی مطرح میشه در خصوص
The important point is that sometimes there is ambiguity about the nationality of the tanker and questions are raised about whether it was an American or Vietnamese vessel. We usually see that some nations use their tankers under other nations' flags, and sometimes the crew members aren't even the nationals of that country. The United States was controlling the ship. It took Iranian oil, transported it to the tanker at sea, and was carrying it towards its own waters. There's no doubt about this, but it has done so under a new appearance and form.
Mr. Ajorlu is an analyst whom we got to have a chat with at the Tehran Strategic Studies Institute. He gave us his take on the oil tanker situation. Given the general standoff between Iran and America, what's your take on the recent oil tanker situation that occurred close to students' stay in Iran?
سیاست چماق و هویج یک سیاست سنتی است از سوی آمریکا.
This stick and carrot policy is a traditional approach the United States has adopted toward the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we have seen many times that the United States, especially under the recent administrations of President Obama, Trump, and then Biden, has repeatedly stated that they are willing to pursue diplomacy on an international stage. They call for engaging in diplomacy, but in practice we see they resort to military, security, and political threats to put pressure on the Islamic Republic. This raises a question for the Islamic Republic about whether the US is honest in its words and actions.
Here's how this country's action or reaction went. Iran's forces landed their helicopters on the second vessel's deck and navigated it toward Iranian waters with the oil. The IRGC Navy's drone units, speedboats and other vessels, meanwhile, assisted the operation. Oil Minister Javad Orji summed it up in explaining America's intentions. Iran's enemies had resorted to the act of piracy after realizing that the Islamic Republic was determined to export its fuel despite the United States sanctions targeting the country, he said. As for whether and how American forces ever present in our regional waters took action or not in response to Iran's reaction, why would the US cause yet another standoff with Iran in snatching its oil just before Students' Day in this country and before the JCPOA revival Vienna talks the US is almost threatening Iran into? The USS Sullivan's DDG-68 and USS Michael Murphy DDG-112, two American destroyers, approached the second tanker. This was to prevent its recapture, but they were warned away by the IRGC Navy. After the heliborne operation, U.S. forces started pursuing the second vessel with several helicopters and warships, but they stopped short of capturing it, IRGC Public Relations reported. U.S. forces then dispatched more warships to block the vessel that was carrying the stolen crude, but again they stopped short and aborted the operation and area.
قدرت دفاعی و امنیتی جمهوری اسلامی
The defense and security power of the Islamic Republic of Iran has increased. The Islamic Republic isn't simply making claims. Almost all international and regional observers acknowledge that. Nations boost their military and security potentials to increase deterrence against impending threats. The same seems to have happened in this incident as well. The Islamic Republic has faced the threat and responded to it in the most appropriate way. To that end, it has been willing to conduct a military maneuver. That's because Iran has come to the conclusion that if it does not respond to the US's excessive demands, the vital interests of the Iranian people will be jeopardized.
If the US expected Iran to sit back and watch, that's exactly what happened to its own forces, while Iran did take action. Mr. Asafari is an MP, moderate in some ways, but like most anyone here, he sees no two ways when it comes to oil snatching and a show of force and retaliation.
Our motto is that if there can't be any oil trade in Iranian waters, this can't be applicable solely to Iran. We won't allow them to sell oil in the region if we can't do the same. Our tanker was navigating on its route before it was confronted by a US warship, but the presence of the IRGC's powerful navy made them give up the tanker so we could return to our territorial waters. We did not let them prevent us from selling our oil.
So far, US invincibility seems like no more than a myth. The US still maintains a presence, even throws about its weight on the world stage. It is weighty, but it's no longer the only big boy on the block. Iran is an upcoming power, or at least unafraid or reluctant to bow to imperialism and hegemony.
Yes, I believe that the hegemony of arrogance was broken in the aftermath of February 1979. Until then, no one dared to chant slogans against the United States and protest against Washington. But now, you see when the American president visits Iraq, an Iraqi journalist greets him with a shoe. Or when the president of the United States goes to an Asian, African, or even a European country, people greet him with rotten tomatoes. These behaviors did not exist before the victory of the Islamic Revolution.
And there are two ready-made world powers already out there. That's Russia and China. America may still be the front-runner in military might and technology, but it's only a matter of time. Iran has demonstrated how invincibility is a myth in more than one instance, portraying the US as a menace and sponsor of terror more than anything. In January 2020, Nabil Raouk, the deputy head of Hezbollah's executive council, said of Iran's precision missile strikes at U.S. military bases in Iraq in retaliation for the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force of Iran's Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, IRGC, shattered Washington's invincibility myth. And that just marks the start of a possible response. It sent out a message that American targets in West Asia are within reach wherever they are. With the given oil tanker incident, one might wonder, how far could the US have gone in retaliation and why?
If the Americans wanted to react, they would have done so in the 40 years that have elapsed since the victory of the Islamic Revolution. They have been threatening us militarily, politically, and economically for 40 years. They do not dare to take military action, because today the US Navy's 5th Fleet is within range of our Zelzal missiles and long-range surface-to-sea and anti-ship missiles.
What do authorities in Iran say of the US causing an oil incident with this country? And what do the people of the world think about an American presence in all matters global? Let's see through the lens of other media outlets. For a quick media review, I give you Sarah.
Hello and welcome to the news part of the program with me, Sarah Adema. Today we will be looking at some media reviews regarding Iran-US confrontation in the Oman Sea. Our first review here is from Tasnim News Agency. President Raisi says, Iranian nation victorious in face of US hostilities. Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi referred to decades of U.S. hostile acts against the country and said that since the victory of the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian nation has been the one emerging victorious in the face of these animosities. The U.S. enmity with the Iranian nation goes back not to 4 but to 7 decades ago, the president said in a gathering of the people of Semnan, a city 180 kilometers east of Tehran, held to commemorate the National Day of the fight against global arrogance. Raisi said in the first 3 decades, the Americans managed to plunder the Iranian people's assets with coup and support from puppet rulers. However, over the past 43 years after the victory of the revolution, the victor in this battle against the endless enmities of the Americans has been the Iranian nation. He also hailed the recent IRGC Navy confrontation with the U.S. forces in the Sea of Oman and described the Americans' act of piracy as abominable. Let's check out another review from Mehr News Agency. Iranian general warns enemies not to test power of IRGC and army. Major General Gholam Ali Rashid made the remarks among the army commanders in the area of the Zulfaqar 1400 military exercise. Referring to the capabilities and combat readiness of the Army of the Islamic Republic of Iran, General Rashid said, "The Iranian army and armed forces are always ready for a strategic, operational, and tactical confrontation with the aim of maintaining the security, stability, and territorial integrity of Iran against the coalition of enmities, specifically the U.S. Zionist coalition." He also stressed Iran armed forces, including IRGC or the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps and army forces, will respond decisively to any threats by any arrogant and aggressor power at any level and from the origin of any country. Our last review from Truthout reads, people worldwide name US as a major threat to world peace. Here is why. How is it that people across the globe have come to agree that the United States is now one of the primary threats to world peace and democracy? Having leveled 2 Japanese cities with atomic bombs and established itself as the world's top superpower following the collapse of the international order in the aftermath of World War II, the US quickly became intoxicated by its newfound military superiority. The US soon went on to introduce a doctrine that positions itself as the world's police, drop more bombs in the Korean and Vietnamese wars than there had been dropped in the whole course of World War II, and orchestrate military coup against democratically elected governments throughout Latin America. It ended up in turn supporting brutal dictatorship and establishing more foreign military bases than any other nation or empire in history all over the globe. In the 20th century, labeling various activities terrorism was one way of rationalizing the use of force. The US did this especially with its allies in response to anti-colonial liberation movements. So the South African apartheid regime called anti-apartheid resistance terrorism, and the Israeli regime did and continues to do the same to Palestinian resistance, however non-violent. The US has armed and defended these states, embracing and promoting the rhetoric of war against terrorism. That's it for me in today's edition, and now back to you, Leila.
About the American presence and the given October incident, the prominent Palestinian Arab journalist and editor-in-chief of Raya al-Yawm, Abdul Bari Atwan, wrote, "The seizure of Iran's oil shipment by U.S. forces constitutes the most heinous form of official piracy and a public declaration of war against Iran." He believes Iran's response to piracy shocked America, as it expected Iran to put up with the blow and not respond. Whereas the Iranian operation to release its stolen oil shipment carried the message that the country's armed forces are not afraid of any military confrontation with the United States, regardless of the price.
اتفاقی که
Speaking of what happened in the Oman Sea a week before November 4th, the United States has imposed sanctions on other countries besides us, such as Venezuela, Syria, and several other countries. Given that we are being asked to sell oil and oil condensate, we won't be losing on both fronts. We don't accept facing sanctions and at the same time being forced to surrender our uranium and centrifuges, ending our nuclear activities, and not being allowed to trade.
We saw what happened during the downing of the Global Hawk drone. The American officials initially announced that the drone has been shot down, so they needed to respond. But soon we saw that the Trump administration officials thought better of it and didn't do anything. The other issue was the airstrike on the Ain al-Assad airbase Iran conducted in retaliation for US assassination of General Soleimani and the Pentagon's subsequent censorship of the fact. The Pentagon tried to hide the fact that 110 of its forces suffered concussions and brain injuries. The reason was that according to the strategies the Pentagon, CENTCOM and White House have laid out, creating unpredictable tensions with Iran would hurt the US interests.
Talking of competition that'll leapfrog to curb a US military power monopoly, the US's congressionally created National Defense Strategy Commission reports itself that Russia and China possess precision strike capabilities, integrated air defenses, cruise and ballistic missiles, advanced cyber warfare, and anti-satellite capabilities. Also, another congressionally created watchdog group, the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, reports that China has recently introduced a new stealth fighter, the J-20, and that its growing ballistic and cruise missile inventory can target US bases and surface ships, including aircraft carriers. Also, Russia claimed to have successfully tested a shipborne hypersonic missile that travels at roughly 8 times the speed of sound, which the US apparently has no defense against. Among regional countries and beyond, Iran stands out. It has suffered unprecedented US sanctions and pressure, even assassinations of its nuclear scientists by US ally Israel. Yet it has stood up to imperialism and hegemony and even managed to greatly resist it. Our guest explains how Iran differs.
ببینید خب امروز جمهوری اسلامی ایران یک توانمندی بسیار بالایی را به
Well, today the Islamic Republic of Iran has gained considerable capabilities. The capabilities of the Islamic Republic's armed forces are used as deterrents. Our equipment and facilities aren't dependent on any world power, be it Eastern or Western. Our capabilities originate from the inside. We currently have anti-radar missiles. We also have radars that can detect anti-radar missiles. We have armed parts of our sea so we can respond to any threat against the Islamic Republic.
There is no international trade or political relationship with Iran that is not sanctioned by the United States. US sanctions were reinstated in 2018 after America's withdrawal from the JCPOA, particularly those sanctions imposed on the energy, shipping and financial sectors in November of that year. This caused foreign investment to dry up and hit Iran's oil exports. But Iran succeeded in continuing its economic life and even flourishing in some areas all the same. And this is the main reason that pulled down the US from sitting on the summit to ask Iran to come to the negotiating table.
در دنیای جدید اکثر کشورها
In the New World, most countries try to make concessions when it comes to the economy and their domestic governance. The Islamic Republic of Iran entered the JCPOA negotiations due to the internal demands, but it was faced with the US reneging on its promises. The Islamic Republic has come to the conclusion that any time it has started a process with the US, it has been the American side that disrupted and challenged it.
Sanctions and incarceration have encouraged Iran to reinforce its defenses and work on technological advancement in some fields more than others. Say, with Trump's US's binning of the nuclear deal of 2015 and European parties not managing or wanting to live up to their share of the commitment, Iran revived and unbridled its nuclear program, which it has maintained as peaceful all along, and which it had choked in compliance with the nuclear deal or JCPOA. To mark National Nuclear Technology Day, Iran in April and after the opening week of Vienna talks started feeding gas to cascades of new advanced centrifuges. It also unveiled dozens of achievements to show its nuclear program is peaceful. 133 technological innovations for both medical and civilian use were unveiled. Iran turned to the IR-6 centrifuge, said to be capable of producing 10 times more uranium hexafluoride, UF6, than IR-1. That's Iran's first-generation centrifuge. And it says it can industrialize these machines without any reliance outside the country. Also, mechanical tests began on the top-of-the-line IR-9 centrifuge that has a separative capacity of 50 SWU. Also, a unit to assemble and evaluate advanced centrifuges was launched in Natanz. And the second phase of industrial production of deuterium compounds was launched at the Arak Heavy Water Reactor Facility. Iran has been enriching uranium to 60%, and that 60% enriched uranium has mounted to 25 kilograms, Iran recently announced. Looking at the oil tanker situation and how Iran acted upon it, would you say that this country can act as a role model for other countries? To what extent can it do so?
بعد از پیروزی
Well, following the victory of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, we saw that discursive, political and ideological branches of Iran's anti-imperialist viewpoint spread across the world, both in the immediate region and other geographical areas, including Latin America. But let's not forget that when these discourses are coupled with hard and military power, we definitely see it grow, or, to use a better word, increasingly expand.
Apart from the world catching up, the US has also weakened itself by overreaching in its adventurism and venturing into not properly pre-planned wars. Actually, former President Trump had put Iran next on the possible hit list. From the American Civil War through the Korean War, US conflicts have mostly been paid for by taxes and war bonds. But in the post-September 11 era, US military spending has almost entirely been financed by debt. It took $2.2 trillion to finance the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, according to figures from Brown University's Costs of War project. And that sum, which is roughly 10% of the country's total gross domestic product, GDP, only reflects upfront costs. By including the cost of interest, we'd be adding another $2.1 trillion by 2030. And through 2050, the interest alone should top $6.5 trillion, even if war spending had theoretically stopped in 2019. That's according to research published last year from Heidi Peltier, director of the 20 Years of War project at Boston University's Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, CBS reports. Never mind the cost of war, there's domestic financial demands US President Biden has to address at home. That'll be it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do join us again at the same times next week and each week after for more on tight spots and how to survive or get out of them, or anything else. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube via @IranTodayShow. Bye for now.